We're all familiar with the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust, 6 million. But did you ever wonder how many of the Nazis were brought to justice? The number is actually disturbingly small. Some estimates range from 5 to 10%, and some even say way less. But thankfully, some of them were caught and brought to justice. Their capture raised many questions. What does evil look like when it's dressed in ordinary clothes? How does the world come to terms with those responsible for rounding up, deporting, and exterminating millions of innocent people? Let's take a look at the kidnapping, trial, and execution of one of the flat-out worst men in history, Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was known as the architect of the Holocaust and the final solution, the mass extermination of 6 million Jews during World War II, one of the most horrifying experiences in world history. The guy had major problems. I mean, what kind of person actually says, as Eichmann did, "I will leap into my grave laughing because having 5 million human beings on my conscience is a source of extraordinary satisfaction"? Well, maybe it's what you'd expect from a Nazi who was buddies with Hitler. Eichmann's capture and death sentence is one of the most famous and satisfying stories of vengeance against the Nazis, with the Jews bringing one of the most significant Holocaust perpetrators to justice. But let's back up a little. In 1945, after the end of World War II, the world, and especially the Jewish people, faced a lot of tricky questions. How do you respond to genocide on that major of a scale? How do you hold those responsible accountable? What are the ethics in bringing them down? And how do you go about exacting justice? Eichmann's trial raised all these questions and more. Before he was tried in Jerusalem in 1961, many knew about the extent of the Nazis' nefariousness, but few who experienced it firsthand were comfortable speaking about it publicly. All of that changed after the trial, the first trial in the world to be fully televised, when the world learned the full extent of what the Jews went through. Eichmann, easily the second worst Adolf to ever live, rose through the SS ranks to become a lieutenant colonel and one of Hitler's top deputies. He had several bureaucratic positions in his Nazi career, but where he really shined was in organizing the logistics of deporting mass numbers of Jews throughout Europe to the Nazis' death camps. He quickly made a name for himself as a master administrator through planning and implementing the final solution to the Jewish question. After World War II ended, Eichmann fled to Argentina, a noted safe haven for Nazis, where he lived in relative quiet under the fake name Ricardo Clement until the late 1950s. His kids, however, kept their infamous last name, which is one of the bits of information used to track down the former SS colonel. What followed was a top-secret mission called Operation Finale, now a major motion picture. The capture went down like this. Eichmann was on his way home from his job at a Mercedes-Benz workshop when a man approached him, smiling and waving. The man, an undercover Mossad agent, asked Eichmann in Spanish if he had a moment to chat. Eichmann grew suspicious and tried to run away, but before he could, other agents swarmed him and shoved him into a car. They took him to a safe house, and after being asked his identity several times, he finally admitted he was Adolf Eichmann and asked for a glass of wine. Nothing quite says arch-villain like asking for a glass of wine while admitting to the murder of 6 million people. They wanted him to stand trial in Jerusalem, but it took a week to get him to sign an agreement to fly to Israel rather than stand trial in Argentina, which is kind of crazy that the Israelis wouldn't proceed without Eichmann's consent. So they had the right man and his consent to travel, but Israeli leaders were in a tough position. Argentina had a long history of turning down extradition requests for Nazi war criminals hiding in its borders. So, not wanting to lose their great white whale, the Mossad decided to smuggle him out. The agents drugged the Nazi and dressed him in an El Al uniform, Israel's national airline, and then snuck him onto a plane pretending that Eichmann was just a flight attendant who needed to catch up on his Z's. Smuggling Eichmann out was a great call by the Mossad, because sheltering thousands of Nazi fugitives wasn't the only questionable step Argentina took. After Eichmann's capture became public, anti-Semitic incidents in the South American country jumped off the charts, and the country's leadership expelled Israel's ambassador as payback. What gives, Argentina? Why expel diplomats instead of mass murderers? It made sense for Israel to not ask permission. Eichmann's capture gave rise to many fiery debates, like, is it flouting international law for one country to smuggle an accused criminal out of another country as a way of getting around thorny extradition laws? Can a country decide that a criminal should stand trial on their soil when his crime and arrest occurred in a different country? The American Jewish Committee was outraged by Israel's decision to try Eichmann in Jerusalem, arguing that the war criminal had perpetrated horrors against Jews and non-Jews alike, and not even specifically against the state of Israel, which didn't exist at the time. They believed an international tribunal in Germany was more fitting. But David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, strongly disagreed, calling the decision to try Eichmann in Jerusalem our historical duty toward the 6 million of our brethren who were murdered. Many nations were appalled by Israel's decision. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution against Israel, surprise, stating that Israel violated Argentina's sovereignty. Israel's actions were condemned by the United States, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. These countries were mainly afraid that if Israel faced no consequences after snatching a fugitive from a foreign land, other countries might do the same, which could eat away at international peace, something no one wanted in the years immediately after the Second World War. But for others, Jews, Israelis, the capture of Eichmann by the 12-year-old country of Israel was worthy of celebration. As one of Eichmann's biographers put it, the purpose of catching Eichmann was clear from the beginning. 1, to remind the world what the Germans did to the Jews, and 2, to remind Israeli youth why the state of Israel needed to exist. The capture, trial, and execution of Eichmann showed the world and the Jewish people that Jewish blood is not cheap, and that while the Jewish people had no autonomy for nearly 2,000 years, they were now capable of taking matters into their own hands and would only depend on themselves for protection. No longer would the Jews be led like sheep to the slaughter, far from it, in fact. Now, they could seek out and track down their wrongdoers wherever they were across the globe and make them face the consequences of their actions. Eichmann's trial began in April of 1961. More than 100 Holocaust survivors gave testimonies, and hundreds of documents were presented as evidence. They painted Eichmann as the main architect of the Holocaust, a diligent worker who facilitated and managed the incredibly tricky logistics involved in the mass deportation of Jews to ghettos, concentration camps, and their eventual deaths. The photos of Eichmann in the courtroom showed a small, balding man with blocky glasses wearing large headphones over his ears to translate the Hebrew. He looked slight and almost subservient. Hannah Arendt, the Jewish-German writer and philosopher who was covering the trial for The New Yorker, wrote that his answers to the prosecution's questions painted an unrepentant man who was unwilling to accept responsibility for his role as a main destroyer of European Jewry. "Why me?" Eichmann asked. "Why not the local policemen? Thousands of them. Everybody killed the Jews. Why me?" Arendt coined the famous term the banality of evil to describe her impression of Eichmann. She described a bland bureaucrat who claimed he was merely following orders from his higher-ups and who, in her words, was neither perverted nor sadistic, but in fact, thoughtless and terrifyingly normal. This was an incredibly controversial take at the time. She described something that disturbed many people. How could Eichmann, who was being called the face of evil in newspapers around the world, be as bad as all that when he looked like a middle-aged man who probably fed pigeons in the park, and who claimed he was just doing his job like everyone else? Arendt wondered if Eichmann was evil in his core or just an ordinary guy who got swept up in a wave of fast-moving fascism and discovered he was good at designing processes to destroy the Führer's enemies. In other words, Arendt wondered if one could do evil without being evil. Now, Arendt had her detractors, including the American writer Norman Podhoretz, who argued that only a vicious anti-Semite could have joined the Nazi Party, and especially the SS. Podhoretz faulted Arendt for what he viewed as her downplaying of Eichmann's bone-deep wickedness. He wrote, "To believe otherwise is to learn nothing about the nature of anti-Semitism. No banality of a man could have done so hugely evil a job so well." He came up with his own phrase in response to Arendt's famous banality of evil, calling the intellectual gymnastics she underwent to come to her conclusion, the perversity of brilliance. Basically, it was this idea that brilliant people can use their mental acuity to explain away nearly anything, including absolute evil. In December 1961, Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes. There was a debate among some of the Israeli leaders about Eichmann's fate. The majority of Knesset pushed execution, which is fascinating, by the way, since capital punishment is practically unheard of in Israel. But a few held out, arguing that life in prison was more humane. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, was hanged in front of a dozen people in a prison just outside of Jerusalem on June 1st, 1962. One of the positive results to come out of the Eichmann trial, aside from bringing a despicable war criminal to justice, was that it removed some of the stigma and shame many Holocaust survivors felt, inspiring thousands of survivors who had gone through the atrocities to speak openly and freely, following in the footsteps of the dozens of witnesses who gave testimony in Jerusalem. The Eichmann trial raised a good number of questions, far more than we have answers to. Some of these include Arendt's question about the true nature of evil. Is it something that appears villainous and larger than life, like the photos and testimonies about Eichmann as an SS leader? Or is it quieter and more mundane, like the meek Eichmann who appeared at his trial? Who was ultimately responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews? Should Israel have had the right to capture Eichmann, or was his abduction abroad a step too far? And to what extent can Nazi hunters go to bring their targets to justice? But at the end of the day, even if the Eichmann trial did raise a lot of unanswerable questions, there are some things about which we can be sure. It changed the way the world viewed the Holocaust. It brought the experiences of the survivors to center stage and exposed the many evils visited upon the Jews and the other victims of Hitler's grand plan. It established Israel, a country in its adolescence, as unwilling to lie down when it had the opportunity to hold murderers accountable, and it confirmed the Jewish people as the architects of their own fate, acting in their own best interests, regardless of how the rest of the world might view them. And it brought a small sliver of justice to the millions of victims and thousands of survivors of the Holocaust. Thanks for watching.